Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 2 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claude Banta. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Charles LEA, Book 1, Chapter 4, Establishment of the Inquisition, Part 2. This was the situation at the accession of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1474. Some years were necessary to settle the question of the succession, disputed by the unfortunate Beltraneja, and to quell the unruly nobles. During this period, Sixtus VI renewed the attempt to introduce the papal inquisition, for in sending Niccolo Franco to Castile as legate, he commissioned him with full inquisitorial faculties to prosecute and punish the false Christians, who after baptism persisted in the observance of Jewish rites. The effort, however, was fruitless, and is interesting chiefly from the evidence which it gives of the desire of Sixtus to give to Castile the blessing of the Inquisition. Ferdinand and Isabella, as we have seen, were habitually jealous of papal encroachments, and were anxious to limit rather than to extend the legatine functions. They did not respond to the papal zeal for the purity of the faith, and even when quiet was to a great extent restored, they took no initiative with regard to a matter which had seemed to Fray Alonso de Espina so immeasurably important. In his capacity of agitator, he had been succeeded by Fray Alonso de Ojeda, prior of the Dominican house of San Pablo of Seville, who devoted himself to the destruction of Judaism, both open as professed by the Jews, and concealed as attributed to the Conversos. The Battle of Toro, March 1, 1476, virtually broke up the party of the Beltraneja, of which the leaders made their peace as best they could, and the sovereigns could at last undertake the task of pacifying the land. At the end of July, 1477, Isabella, after capturing the castle of Trujillo, came, as we have seen, to Seville, where she remained until October 1478. The presence of the court, with Conversos filling many of its most important posts, excited Fray Alonso to greater ardor than ever. It was in vain, however, that he called the Queen's attention to the danger threatening the faith and the state from the multitude of pretended Christians in high places. She was receiving faithful service from members of the class accused, and she probably was too much occupied with the business in hand to undertake a task that could be postponed. It is said that her confessor, Torquemada, at an earlier period, had induced her to take a vow that when she should reach the throne she would devote her life to the extirpation of heresy and the supremacy of the Catholic faith, but this may safely be dismissed as a legend of later date. Be this as it may, all that was done at the moment was that Pero Gonzalez de Mendoza, then Archbishop of Seville, held a synod in which was promulgated a catechism setting forth the belief and duties of the Christians, which was published in the churches and hung up for public information in every parish, while the priests were exhorted to increased vigilance and the frailes to fresh zeal in making converts. The adoption of such a device betrays the previous neglect of all instruction of the Marranos in the new religion imposed on them. The court left Seville, and Ojeda's opportunity seemed to have passed away. Whatever alacrity the priests may have shown in obeying their archbishop, nothing was accomplished, nor was the increased zeal of the frailes rewarded with success. There is a story accredited by all the historians of the Inquisition that Ojeda chanced to hear of a meeting of Jews and Conversos on the night of Good Friday, March 28, 1478, to celebrate their impious rites, and that he hastened with the evidence to Cordova and laid it before the sovereigns, resulting in the punishment of the culprits and turning the scale in favor of introducing the Inquisition. But there is no contemporary evidence of its truth, and the dates are irreconcilable, nor was such an incentive necessary. The insincerity of the conversion of a large portion of the Marranos was incontestable. According to the principles universally accepted at the period, it was the duty of the sovereigns to reduce them to conformity. With the pacification of the land, the time had come to attempt this resolutely and comprehensively, and the only question was as to the method. It was inevitable that there should have been a prolonged struggle in the court before the drastic remedy of the Inquisition was adopted. The efforts of its advocates were directed, not against the despised and friendless Jews, but against the powerful conversos, embracing many of the most trusted counselors of the sovereigns and men high in station in the Church, who could not but recognize the danger impending on all who tracked their descent from Israel. There seems at first to have been a kind of compromise adopted, under which Pedro Fernandez de Solis, Bishop of Cadiz, who was provisor of Seville, with the Assistente Diego de Merlo, Fray Alonso de Hojeda, and some other frailes, were commissioned to take charge of the matter, with power to inflict punishment. This resulted in a report by the commissioners to the sovereigns that a great portion of the citizens of Seville were infected with heresy, that it involved men in high station and power, and that it spread throughout not only Andalusia but Castile, so that it was incurable save by the organization of the Inquisition. The Archbishop Mendoza, doubtless disgusted with the failure of his methods of instruction, joined in these representations, and they had a powerful supporter in Fray Thomas de Torquemada, prior of the Dominican convent of Santa Cruz in Segovia, who, as confessor of the sovereigns, had much influence over them, and who had long been urging the vigorous chastisement of heresy. At last the victory was won. Ferdinand and Isabella resolved to introduce the Inquisition in the Castilian kingdoms, and their ambassadors to the Holy See, the Bishop of Osma and his brother Diego de Santillan, were ordered to procure the necessary bull from Sixtus IV. This must have been shrouded in profound secrecy, for in July 1478, while negotiations must have been on foot in Rome, Ferdinand and Isabella convoked a national synod at Seville, which sat until August 1st. In the proposition laid by the sovereigns before this body, there is no hint that such a measure was desired or proposed, and in the deliberations of the assembled prelates, there is no indication that the Church thought any action against the conversos necessary. Even as late as 1480, after the procurement of the bull and before its enforcement, the Cortes of Toledo presented to the sovereigns a detailed memorial embodying all the measures of reform desired by the people. In this the separation of Christians from Jews and Moors is asked for, but there is no request for the prosecution of apostate conversos. Evidently there was no knowledge of, and no popular demand for, the impending Inquisition. Sixtus can have been nothing loath to accomplish the introduction of the Inquisition in Castile, which his predecessors had so frequently and so vainly attempted, and which he had essayed to do a few years previous by granting the necessary faculties to his legate. If the request of the Castilian sovereigns, therefore, was not immediately granted, it cannot have been from humanitarian motives, as alleged by some modern apologists, but because Ferdinand and Isabella desired, not the ordinary papal inquisition, but one which should be under the royal control, and should pour into the royal treasury the resultant confiscations. Hitherto the appointment of inquisitors had always been made by the provincials of the Dominican or Franciscan orders, according as the territory belonged to one or the other, with occasional interference on the part of the Holy See, from which the commission emanated. It was a delegation of the supreme papal authority, and had always been held completely independent of the secular power, but Ferdinand and Isabella were too jealous of papal interference in the internal affairs of their kingdoms to permit this, and it is an evidence of the extreme desire of Sixtus to extend the Inquisition over Castile that he consented to make so important a concession. There also was doubtless discussion over the confiscations which the wealth of the conversos promised to render large. This was a matter in which there was no universally recognized practice. In France they endured to the temporal seigneur. In Italy the custom varied at different times and in various states, but the papacy assumed control it, and in the 14th century it claimed the whole, to be divided equally between the Inquisition and the papal camera. The matter was evidently one to be determined by negotiation, and in this too the sovereigns had their way, for the confiscations were tacitly abandoned to them. Nothing was said as to defraying the expenses of the institution, but this was inferred by the absorption of the confiscations. If it was to be dependent on the crown must provide for it, and we shall see hereafter the various devices by which a portion of the burden was subsequently thrown upon the Church. The bull, as finally issued, bears date November 1, 1478, and is a very simple affair, which on its face bears no signs of its momentous influence in moulding the destinies of the Spanish peninsula. After reciting the existence in Spain of false Christians and the request of Ferdinand and Isabella that the Pope should provide a remedy, it authorizes them to appoint 3 bishops or other suitable men, priests either irregular or secular, over 40 years of age, masters or bachelors in theology, or doctors or licentiates of canon law, and to remove and replace them at pleasure. These are to have the jurisdiction and faculties of bishops and inquisitors over heretics, their fautors and receivers. Subsequently, Sixtus pronounced the bull to have been drawn inconsiderably and not in accordance with the received practice and the decrees of his predecessors, which doubtless referred to the power of appointment and removal lodged in the crown, and also to the omission of the request of episcopal concurrence in rendering judgment. The creation of inquisitors was in itself an invasion of episcopal jurisdiction, which, from the earliest history of the institution, had been the source of frequent trouble, and where, as in Spain, many bishops were of Jewish blood and therefore under suspicion, the question was more intricate than elsewhere. With respect to this, moreover, it is observable that the bull did not confer, like that of Nicholas V in 1451, jurisdiction over bishops in any special derogation of the decree of Boniface VIII, requiring them, when suspected of heresy, to be tried by the Pope. Both of these questions, as we shall see, subsequently gave rise to considerable discussion. So far the anti-Semitic party had triumphed, but Isabella's hesitation to exercise the powers thus obtained shows that the conversos in her court did not abandon the struggle, and that for nearly 2 years they succeeded in keeping the balance even. It is possible also that Ferdinand was not inclined to a severity of which he could not forecast the economical disadvantages, for as late as January 1482 a letter from him to the inquisitors of his kingdom of Valencia manifests a marked preference for the use of mild and merciful methods. Whatever may have been the influence at work, it was not until September 17, 1480, that the momentous step was taken which was to exercise so sinister an influence on the destinies of Spain. On that day commissioners were issued to 2 Dominicans, Miguel de Murillo, Master of Theology, and Juan de San Martin, Bachelor of Theology and Friar of San Pablo in Seville, who were emphatically told that any dereliction of duty would entail their removal, with forfeiture of all their temporalities and denationalization in the kingdom, thus impressing on them their subordination to the crown. Still there were delays. October 9th a royal order commanded all officials to give them free transportation and provisions on their way to Seville, where, as in the most infected spot, operations were to commence. When they reached the city they waited on the chapter and presented their credentials. The municipal council met them at the chapter house door and escorted them to the city hall, where a formal reception took place and a solemn procession was organized for the following Sunday. They were thus fairly installed, but apparently they still found difficulties thrown in their way, for on December 27th it was deemed necessary to issue a royal cedula to the officials ordering them to render aid to the inquisitors. They had not waited for this to organize their tribunal, with Dr. Juan Ruiz de Medina as assessor, and Juan Lopez del Barco, a chaplain of the Queen, as promotor fiscal, or prosecuting officer. To these were added, May 13, 1481, Diego de Merlo, assistente or corregidor of Seville, and the licitiante Ferran Yanez de Lobon as receivers of confiscations, an indispensable office in view of the profits of persecution. All soon found plenty of work. The conversos of Seville had not been unmindful of the coming tempest. Many of them had fled to the lands of the neighboring nobles in the expectation that feudal jurisdiction would protect them, even against a spiritual court such as that of the Inquisition. To prevent this change of domicile, a royal decree ordered that no one should leave any place where inquisitors were holding their tribunal, but in the general terror this arbitrary command received scant obedience. A more efficient step was a proclamation addressed on January 2, 1481, to the Marquis of Cadiz and other nobles by the frailes Miguel and Juan. This proved that no error had been made in the selection of those who were to lay the foundations of the Inquisition, and that a new era had opened for Spain. The two simple friars spoke with an assured audacity to grandees who had been wont to treat with their sovereign on almost equal terms, an audacity which must have appeared incredible to those to whom it was addressed, but to which Spain in time became accustomed from the Holy Office. The great Rodrigo Ponce de Leon and all other nobles were commanded to search their territories, to seize all strangers and newcomers, and to deliver them within 15 days at the prison of the Inquisition, to sequestrate their property and confide it, properly inventoried, to trustworthy persons who should account for it to the king or to the inquisitors. In vigorous language they were told that any failure in obeying these orders would bring upon them excommunication, removable only by the inquisitors on their superiors, with forfeiture of rank and possessions and the release of their vassals from allegiance and from all payments due, a release which the inquisitors assumed to grant in advance, adding that they would prosecute them as fautors, receivers, and defenders of heretics. This portentous utterance was effective. The number of prisons was speedily so great that the convent of San Pablo, which the inquisitors at first occupied, became insufficient, and they obtained permission to establish themselves in the great fortress of Triana, the stronghold of Seville, of which the immense size and the gloomy dungeons rendered it appropriate for the work in hand. There were other conversos, however, who imagined that resistance was preferable to flight. Diego de Suzan, one of the leading citizens of Seville, whose wealth was estimated at 10 millions of maravedis, assembled some of his prominent brethren of Seville, Utrera, and Carmona to deliberate as to their action. The meeting was held in the church of San Salvador and comprised ecclesiastics of high rank, magistrates, and officials belonging to the threatened class. Civic tumults had been so customary a resource when any object was to be gained, that Suzan naturally suggested, in a fiery speech, that they should recruit faithful men, collect a store of arms, and that the first arrest by the inquisitors should be the signal of a rising in which the inquisitors should be slain, and thus an emphatic warning be given to deter others from renewing the attempt. In spite of some faint-heartedness manifested by one or two of those present, the plan was adopted, and steps were taken to carry it out. When Pedro Fernandez Venedera, mayordomo of the cathedral, one of the conspirators, was arrested, weapons to arm 100 men were found in his house, showing how active the preparations on foot. The plot would doubtless have been executed, and have led to a massacre, such as we have so often seen in the Spanish cities, but for a daughter of Diego Suzan, whose loveliness had won for her the name of the Formosa Fembra. She was involved with an intrigue with a Christian caballero, to whom she revealed the secret, and it was speedily conveyed to the inquisitors. Nothing could better have suited their purpose. If there had been any feeling of opposition to them on the part of the authorities, it disappeared, and the most important members of the Converso community were in their power. Diego de Merlo, the assistente of Seville, arrested at the bidding of the inquisitors the richest and most honorable Conversos, magistrates and dignitaries who were confined in San Pablo and thence transferred to the castle of Triana. The trials were prompt, and at the rendering of sentence a consulta de fe or assembly of experts was convoked, consisting of lawyers and the provisor of the bisphoric, thus recognizing the necessity of concurrent action on the part of the episcopal jurisdiction. What justified the sentence of burning it would be difficult to say. It was not obstinate heresy, for one at least of the victims is stated to have died as a good Christian. It could not have been the plot, for this, in so far as it was an ecclesiastical offence, was merely impeding the Inquisition, and even the assassins of St. Peter Martyr, when they professed repentance, were admitted to penance. It was a new departure, in disregard of all the canons, and it gave warning that the new Inquisition of Spain was not to follow in the footsteps of the old, but was to mark out for itself a yet bloodier and more terrible career. Justice was prompt, and the first auto de fe was celebrated February 6, 1481, when 6 men and women were burnt, and the sermon was preached by Fray Alonso de Hojeda, who now saw the efforts of so many years crowned with success. He might well say nunc dimittis, for though a second auto followed in a few days, his eyes were not to rejoice at the holy spectacle, for the pestilence, which was to carry off 15,000 of the people of Seville, was now commencing, and he was one of the earliest victims. In the second auto there were only 3 burnings. Diego de Suzan, Manuel Solís, and Bartolome Torrebala, three of the wealthiest and most important citizens of Seville. As though to show that the work thus begun was to be an enduring one, a quemadero, brasero, or burning place was constructed in the Campo de Tablada, so massively that its foundations can still be traced. On 4 pillars at the corners were erected statues of the prophets in plaster of Paris, apparently to indicate that although technically the burning was the work of secular justice, it was performed at the command of religion. Further arrests and burnings promptly followed, the wealth and prominence of the victims proving that here was a tribunal which was no respecter of persons, and that money or favor could avail nothing against its rigid fanaticism. The flight of the terror-stricken conversos was stimulated afresh, but the Inquisition was not thus to be balked of its prey. Flight was forbidden, and guards were placed at the gates, where so many were arrested that no place of confinement sufficiently capacious for them could be found. Yet notwithstanding this, great numbers escaped to the lands of the nobles, to Portugal, and to the Moors. The plague now began to rage with violence. God and man seemed to be uniting for the destruction of the unhappy conversos, and they petitioned Diego de Merlo to allow them to save their lives by leaving the pest-ridden city. Their request was humanely granted to those who could procure passes, on condition that they should leave their property behind and only take with them what was necessary for immediate use. Under these regulations multitudes departed, more than 8,000 finding refuge at Mairena, Marchena, and Palacios. The Marquis of Cadiz, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and other nobles received them hospitably, but many kept on to Portugal or to the Moors, and some, we are told, even found refuge in Rome. The inquisitors themselves were obliged to abandon the city, but their zeal allowed them no respite. They removed their tribunal to Aracena, where they found ample work to do, burning there 23 men and women, besides the corpses and bones of numerous deceased heretics exhumed for the purpose. When the pestilence diminished, they returned to Seville and resumed their work there with unrelaxing ardor. According to a contemporary, by the 4th of November they had burnt 298 persons and had condemned 79 to perpetual prison. End of Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 2.